All right, everyone good? Okay, let's begin then. I give a minute for people to enter. Good evening, folks. I'm just going to give a couple minutes for people to enter the room. Then we'll go ahead and get started. Just give it one more minute. All right, we can go ahead and get started this evening. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. No matter where you are in the world, I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Neil DeSantiseo. I'm an events manager and an international development fellow for the Young Professionals in Foreign Policy, also known as YPFP. YPFP works to build the leaders tomorrow needs, and we do this by providing YPFP members with capacity building programs, engaging events, a global community of peers, and opportunities to elevate their voices through writing, like the YPFP Fellowship, and publication. We're delighted to have a great panel of YPFP Fellows this evening. Join us to discuss multilateralism in crisis. Now, multilateralism, which some of you may understand best through an organization like the UN, or perhaps the EU, or other regional organizations, or even a more basic definition as the practice of coordinating national policies in groups of 3 or more states. Pretty basic, but as with everything in foreign policy, it's quite often more complicated than just a nominal definition. Beyond a basic definition, tonight we might ask, how does multilateralism play a role in armed control, economic development, some of the other topic areas that tonight's fellows will be touching upon. Tonight's event, as you know, is called Multilateralism in Crisis, but I have to say, when we first conceived of this event, I thought to include a question mark in parentheses at the end to not make it seem so definitive. It's a good question. What is the state of multilateralism? What can we expect in the year to come? I won't be surprised if this evening's discussion gives us some quite nuanced perspectives of it. Now, before I introduce our great panel of YPFP Fellows, I have a few administrative items to talk about. First, just a quick preview of the agenda. We'll go over some introductions, touch on a couple of preconceived topics that fellows have researched and written about as fellows, and then, time permitting, get some questions in from the audience. Certainly want to give an opportunity for some of that audience interaction. I look forward to some interesting discussion, and perhaps with so many topic areas represented here, maybe you'll learn something new. I definitely will. I can say that with 100% certainty now. Now, as far as Q&A is concerned, feel free to submit your questions using the chat function at the bottom right of your screen. I will be organizing the questions, and then I'll be reading them out loud and directing them to the panelists that I think would best be suited to answer, and then of course give an opportunity for the other fellows to speak. As for a disclaimer, I just want to say, and some of the fellows might already say this, all of our panelists are speaking on behalf of themselves. They're not representatives in this case of their respective organizations, places of work, or any other affiliations this evening. Now, I want to take some time to introduce our panel of fellows. The first one I'd like to introduce is Pierre Johnson. He's our Economics and Trade Fellow. He is based in New York City as a freelance journalist. He's a VP of Business Development for an international education firm. He holds a dual master's degree from Fordham University in International Political Economy and Development and Economics. And he's also a recipient of a grant from Fordham University. He studied emerging markets at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Thank you for joining us this evening. I think he likes to be called PJ.
PJ, yeah, a little easier.
Appreciate it, PJ. Thanks for joining us. All right, and our second panelist will be Monica Weller, who is our Gender and Foreign Policy Fellow. Now, Monica is a Policy Research Fellow for the Center of East Asian Studies at Johns Hopkins, where she analyzes political trends in Northeast Asia. She conducted a Fulbright in Mongolia, graduated with honors from Knox College with a BA in International Relations and minors in Japanese and Gender and Women's Studies. Her research interests include democracy studies, LGBTQ issues, and women's rights. Welcome this evening, Monica. And next we have Betsy. Betsy G. Henderson is our Africa Fellow. She consults for Weems Corporation LLC, and writes about economic development, technology, and healthcare in Africa. She began her career serving at the Caucus for Women's Leadership in Kenya, and later in DC for the Whitaker Group. She graduated with an MA in International Relations from American University, and graduated with a BA in Foreign Affairs and English from the University of Virginia. And she's a member of the Resolution Project Fellows Network and resides in South Carolina. Welcome, Betsy.
Thank you, Neil. Thanks, everyone.
All right, let's go ahead and move to Philip Kowalski. He is our Middle East Fellow. He's a foreign affairs analyst based in DC. He's written essays on international affairs for the Washington Kurdish Institute and Middle East Institute, where he was a research assistant in 2019, completed his MA at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies. And prior to attending graduate school, Philip lived in Turkey between 2012 and 2016, and holds a BA in history from the University of Cincinnati. Welcome, Philip. All right, and last but not least, we have Andrew Carroll, who's our WMD Deterrence and Non-Proliferation Fellow. Andrew Carroll is an officer in the US Air Force and a graduate student. Well, I think he just recently graduated at Columbia University. He's originally from Mission Viejo, California. He's a graduate of the US Air Force Academy, where he studied foreign area studies and took part in a military exchange program with the French Air Force École de l'Air. Andrew has served as a policy fellow with the US Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and has written on US-Russia defense relations as part of the Stanford US-Russia Forum. Welcome, Andrew.
Pleasure, thanks for having me.
And I just want to back up a little. I don't know if I said if Philip was our Middle East Fellow, but that is the fact. He's a Middle East Fellow. All right, now that we've got all those wonderful introductions out of the way, I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. I hope we can get into some interesting discussions tonight. And of course, I'll try to not speak as much anymore. We did talk about a few topics beforehand, so we can just go right into it and talk about multilateralism. So all of the fellows as YPFP fellows on this panel this evening have just completed 9 months of researching and writing for the fellowship. And what a year it was. Collectively, you'll all publish quite a few articles to date, exploring a wide breadth of topics. And tonight, I just want to give the audience a sample of that breadth this evening. So here's my first question. Considering your YPFP fellow experience and your area of expertise, give your perspective on the state of multilateralism today. Is it in crisis? Is it on the rebound? Does it depend? Let's give up to 3 minutes to each fellow to give their point of view, starting with Monica.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here. And just as a disclaimer, I'm not representing anyone but myself tonight. So in terms of multilateralism, especially for gender, I do think it's in flux right now. I mean, you definitely saw the peak of multilateralism back in the 90s due to humanitarian kind of interventions and the like. But at the same time, even though the world hasn't necessarily relied on the UN and other such international or governing organizations as it has in the past, I think that you've seen kind of the development of regional and bilateral relationships. So multilateralism comes in many different shapes and sizes, as I think we'll hear tonight. But I do think that it's in flux because you're seeing both an increase of it, especially with a collectively globalizing world, the media. More and more people are aware of what's happening in other countries, and so therefore they can pressure their governments to interact and to work on different issues in different areas. But at the same time, you are seeing quite a few authoritarian states and populist leaders win, which has decreased multilateralism or the will to negotiate with people and states other than your own. So in terms of gender, I do think that multilateralism is critical for gender because you see a lot of international organizations like the OECD or the UN or the WHO kind of putting forth gender treaties and agreements that go beyond simply a basis of a state. So you're trying to set quotas worldwide. And I do think that collectively there has been a lot of improvements over the year. This year in particular has been difficult, but overall, I think that you are seeing greater representation of female leadership, as well as kind of increases in girls' education and a lot of positive factors, although this year could set that trend back significantly. So I guess multilateralism is, I do think it still has a stronghold and it still has a place in society, but it's also shaky depending on what region of the world you're talking about.
Thanks for that, Monica. In flux. I like that phrase, but still important. All right. Let's go ahead and move to Betsy's perspective. What's your perspective on multilateralism today?
Thanks, Neil. Well, to build on what Monica has mentioned tonight, I'm going to speak a little specifically to Africa. And I think how we define the state of multilateralism in regards to the African continent really depends on the lens that we use to define it. And I think when we are, while multilateralism maybe can be considered in crisis in some parts of the world due to countries seeking more nationalist agendas or more protectionist trade policies, in Africa, African countries are both beneficiaries of global multilateralism as well as active participants. And for this reason, I think if we think about multilateralism as more generally sort of an alliance of multiple countries pursuing a common goal, there's three ways I think we need to consider multilateralism in the context of Africa today. And the first is international multilateral organizations operating in Africa. So that could be the UN, WTO, even the World Health Organization. Secondly would be the role of African countries as member nations of those international multilateral organizations. And that's thinking about, the representation of African countries in the UN, at the WTO, and things like that. And then thirdly, the role of African multilateral organizations themselves. And the third is what I'm really excited to delve into the most over the course of this conversation. But I wanted to provide just some quick kind of big picture concepts within those three lenses. Because the first, when I think about multilateralism in Africa, I think about the 26 UN system offices based in Africa. I think about the 8 peacekeeping missions across the continent. I think about the fact that most of the activities, regardless of the organization or the countries involved in it, most multilateral organizations are seeking to accomplish sort of three things. And one is maintaining peace and global security. Secondly, promoting economic development. And third, managing global change, like population growth or promoting sustainable human development, enforcing or keeping up with the trying to meet the SDGs, things like that. And secondly, when I think about the role of African organizations in international multilateral organizations, I'm reminded that 54 countries are members of the 193 of the UN. That's about 28% of the United Nations. In fact, this year, there are 3 African countries that are non-permanent members of the UN Security Council, and that is South Africa, Niger, and Tunisia. And even in the WTO, we see where African countries make up about 27% of the WTO, and seeing the rise or potential rise of former Nigerian Finance Minister Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala is really exciting to see where that may go. So I'm going to leave it at that and go into a little bit of the African organizations, multilateral organizations later, but just generally the AU and many of the regional bodies, I think, will inform that discussion. So my short answer depends on the lens you take.
All right, it looks like I called it. So we've definitely got a lot to chew on there, and looking forward to explore that more. And of course, depends, like so many things that are complicated in this world. All right, thanks so much, Betsy, appreciate it. Let's go ahead and move to PJ. PJ, what is your perspective on the state of multilateralism today as an economics and trade fellow?
Sure, it depends is a very interesting response. I felt like that was the conclusion of a lot of my grad school classes was, well, it depends on how you define it, right? I think you made a good point first, Neil, that what is multilateralism first? And we have to look at it as some type of agreement or alliance between at least 3 countries, right? So that eliminates any type of deals between 2 countries, bilateralism, which has been, I think, an increasing threat to multilateralism. We have to differentiate that from globalization, right? Is globalization in crisis? I don't think so. World trade flows were on a decline last year after like 30 years of going up. But overall, I think that's just like the stock market. It was just a little bump in the road. So globalization, all the world economies depend on it. So long-term, probably not in crisis. Is multilateralism in crisis? Maybe. How much power, from a trade perspective, how much power does the WTO actually have is certainly an interesting question. But I think when we get a little more into it and when we look at the regional trade agreements and things like, as Betsy was talking about, within the African Union, within what was NAFTA, the new North American trade agreement, we'll find that there is some opportunities for increased cooperation. From a development perspective, I think Monica was mentioning that we did sort of see the peak of that in the 1990s. The future of that is very difficult to say because of reduced funding, obviously, with the way things have been this year. A lot of development missions just haven't been fully funded. So on top of the complexities of these issues, the global pandemic further complicates things. But in brief, multilateralism from an economic perspective definitely has some risks going forward. Globalization, I think, does not.
All right, PJ, thanks very much. And I'm sure we'll get some time to talk about trade agreements, do some differentiating between globalization and multilateralism. Great. Let's go ahead and go to Philip.
Thank you, Neil, and good to be with you, everyone, today. I really like PJ's points about differentiating between globalization and or globalism and multilateralism. Sorry. So I would argue from the perspective of the Middle East that multilateralism is in a state of crisis that probably hasn't existed since the 1930s. We live in an age where the United States has overwhelmingly supported scaling back international commitments, and this mostly has affected the Middle East. And let's just consider that even politicians such as Tulsi Gabbard, who supported unqualified non-interventionism, have a certain cachet at this point. This would not have been the case 10 years ago. She would have been laughed at. Now, this isolationist unilateral streak from Washington has had, again, a disastrous consequence in the Middle East. Let's consider what happened in October 2019, when when President Trump abandoned America's commitment to the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces and gave Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey a green light to invade northern Syria. The result was a human rights catastrophe, hundreds of thousands of displaced people, and a dimming of America's reputation to its allies. Even Noam Chomsky, a traditional opponent to American interventionism, understood that this act in unqualified non-interventionism and unilateralism was a disaster. Also consider what is happening with NATO right now, both in Libya and the Eastern Mediterranean. 9 years ago, the NATO mission in Libya was heralded as a resounding success and a testimony to the necessity of the organization's existence in the post-Cold War era. Now Libya threatens to tear NATO apart. France and Turkey are constantly saber-rattling with each other and occasionally almost come to actual blows. Meanwhile, Turkey is threatening its de jure ally Greece over oil speculation in the Eastern Mediterranean, once again almost coming to blows. These are NATO allies. Where is multilateralism here? This is happening because the will for multilateralism is not there anymore, in my view. Multilateral alliances are seen as expendable and even something to rail against for political place. And when multilateralism does exist in the Middle East, I would argue it's multilateralism from hell. Think about the Abraham Accords. Think about the deal that was just made with Morocco, with 700,000 people living in West Sahara were thrown under the bus for political expediency between Trump and the Moroccan king. Trump's presidency had a large part to do with the relative collapse of multilateralism in the Middle East, but it was already on its way out in the years leading up to 2016. Now, Biden's firm belief in multilateralism is commendable, and his Secretary of State pick, Tony Blinken, is a good pick if Washington wants to restore multilateralism. But will it be enough? I think a lot of that depends on how other actors respond.
All right, thank you very much, Philip. It will be interesting to see sort of how things move, or perhaps not, under a Biden administration. A couple of other things that stick out, that phrase, multilateralism from hell. So right there, you can see that sort of change in how you could describe multilateralism, depending on your regional lens, for instance. So thank you for that. Let's go ahead and move to our last but not least, Andrew.
Well, thanks, Neil. And I just want to say, first of all, thanks to you and all the folks at YPFP for helping to put this event together. And to everyone watching, thanks for joining in tonight. So we're not just, talking into the void here and screaming our thoughts out there. I just want to reiterate as well that, everything I'm saying today is my own personal opinion and absolutely in no way, shape or form representative of the official policy of the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government in any way. So just to begin, when we look at multilateralism from a WMD and non-proliferation context, I think typically we think of it in terms of something like arms control, something as a way to prevent conflict. And from that standpoint, I don't think we can say we're absolutely in a good place. Over the last few years, we've seen the collapse of most arms control treaties that have been considered hallmarks of the post-Cold War world. Think of the INF Treaty, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in Europe, the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, the Open Skies Treaty, all gone. Even the New START Treaty, while it can be extended right now, between an agreement between the US and Russian presidents, still hasn't been extended. It's going to expire in early February of 2021. And on top of that, I think we've seen over these past few years an increased willingness among the nuclear powers of the world to push the line of conflict. Think of India and Pakistan conducting airstrikes against one another. A Pakistani fighter jet shooting down an Indian fighter jet. Indian and Chinese soldiers killing each other in the Himalayas. Turkey and as Philip mentioned, while Turkey's not a nuclear power, Turkey hosts NATO nuclear weapons, as is widely reported. American and Turkish soldiers, NATO allies, nearly came to blows in Syria. So all of this is showing an increasing willingness, I think, of the nuclear powers in the world willing to escalate and push the line a lot closer than we've seen in the past. That being said, I think there have been some interesting initiatives, especially of the non-nuclear weapon states in the world. This year we saw enough countries ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That will come into force early next year. So there are initiatives that are taking place that are showing a willingness. The only issue is, in terms of the WMD world, those countries that possess those weapons that really are seen as the ones that hold that power, possibly then again going to that dichotomy that Betsy mentioned specifically in Africa of the players in versus the outside players, the institutions versus the actual states that are held at risk. That's really where the difference is. So I think the question moving forward, and is this salvageable, is or can multilateral solutions benefit this area, is how can we get different states on board? How can we get them cooperating again to stop pushing the line of conflict, at least in the WMD world? That being said, that's also pushing states closer together in terms of looking to deter one another. So there are a number of new initiatives coming together, such as the Quad in the Indo-Pacific, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, reforming, new initiatives within NATO between the US and states like Poland, for example, all showing that there is an interest in pursuing new regional security initiatives as a result of a fear of increased conflict. So definitely something I think to watch as well, and an interesting way of looking at how we consider multilateral action. It's not just a way to prevent conflict through, for example, like treaties. It's also building new security alliances and getting outside of that traditional mold.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm struck by the bifurcation that you made there between non-nuclear powers and then those that hold the power to, well, rain destruction many times over for the world. And so I think that's an interesting thing that I think we can explore. It's sort of that the power differential between these sort of countries. And speaking of WMDs, arms control, I would just like to start with a topic with you, Andrew. We've seen a number of arms control agreements, as you said, unravel over the last few years, and remaining agreements are still often discussed in a bilateral context. With this in mind, do you think greater multilateral cooperation is possible in the WMD field or nuclear domain?
So I'm generally an optimistic person, and I like to believe that yes, it is. But I think in order to move the ball forward on new arms control initiatives, especially among, for example, the nuclear weapon states of the world, we need to look beyond just the typical framework that we think of in terms of arms control. So take something like the New START Treaty, for example, between the US and Russia, which I am hopeful that it will be renewed, especially as the Biden administration takes over in January. The Russian government seems to have agreed to extend without preconditions at this point, so I'm hopeful there. But when we look at the terms of that treaty, how weapons are counted, how delivery systems are counted in terms of limiting the limiting factors for those countries, I'm not sure if that necessarily works. The Trump administration has made a real issue of trying to get and the need to bring in a country like China into some sort of nuclear arms treaty. I don't think that's really likely given the current state of the Chinese nuclear arsenal, which we can get into. There is some debate on whether or not it's growing or not, but the fact is they're unlikely to join any sort of arms control agreement, and most arms control agreements have been bilateral in the past, such as between the US and the Soviet Union, or between the US and Russia, and counting, for example, high yield strategic nuclear weapons that can impact the cities of both countries. But now we're seeing a development of all new kinds of weapons, like hypersonic weapons, for example, proliferation of lower yield weapons, intermediate range weapons. Now, there's no restrictions on that anymore with the INF treaty gone. So I think a good start, if we're going to rebuild multilateral consensus, is looking at something like emerging technologies, something like hypersonic weapons, for example, something that countries are now just starting to test and develop. Could be a good way to bring, for example, the P5 countries in the UN, also the 5 UN allowed nuclear weapon states under the NPT, together into some sort of accord. And that being said, there is opportunity as well, I think, for non-nuclear weapon states to have some influence on this. I think the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons is a good example that while no nuclear weapons state has joined the accord, that could be a way to push a norm and start pressuring the nuclear states to actually make progress on disarmament in the future.
Great, thanks. I appreciate that. And I am, what I did hear that was interesting to me was how you talked about a lot of these agreements in the past have been bilateral in the past. So Philip, I would love to get your perspective on this. I mean, is bilateral, the way to go, for instance, in the Middle East with regard to WMDs, arms control?
Sure. So I just want to put a disclaimer out there that I'm not a nuclear expert like Andrew, but I'll give my 2 cents. Well, of course, I guess when we're discussing nuclear non-proliferation, the elephant in the room is the JCPOA, that is the so-called Iran nuclear deal that was famously scraped by Trump in the middle of 2018. In my opinion, the scraping of the JCPOA, which was by no means perfect, it was a very flawed treaty, will likely go down in history as one of the worst foreign policy blunders ever in Washington. It sent a clear and resounding message that the United States is unwilling to see through its own diplomatic measures, and that future administrations are willing to revise American foreign policy and treaties based solely on petty domestic political partisanship. I mean, why did Trump want to scrap it? It really seems to have come down to just wanting to overturn everything that Obama did. Now, luckily for Joe Biden, who has signaled that he wants to re-enter the JCPOA or something similar to it, the Iranian regime has also signaled that it is willing to re-enter negotiations. And this is not because the Iranian regime is committed to fighting nuclear proliferation, but because it needs to end sanctions in order to survive. It's a matter of survival for them at this point. And I do envision that a future nuclear agreement between the United States and Iran would involve the European Union, probably China as well, as it becomes more important in Iranian affairs. So it will very much have a multilateral outlook to it. I think it's also important mentioning Turkey too. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has signaled several times recently that he has a desire to arm Turkey with nuclear weapons because he thinks it's hypocritical that Israel has them. And I hate to give Erdogan credit, but a broken clock is right twice a day. It is in a way hypocritical that the United States' stance is to look the other way when Israel has nuclear weapons, and for Turkey to have them is absolutely unthinkable. I don't think anyone should have them. And as long as the United States' stance in the Middle East is essentially might makes right because we say so, I don't think it's going to be very effective in convincing Middle Eastern leaders not to go the nuclear option. I mean, consider that the United States is the one country to have ever used nuclear weapons on a civilian population. Its position on nuclear weapons has always been seen as hypocritical and dishonest by other countries. I'm still not sure American policymakers or the American public understands what a stain the egregious war crimes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have on foreign perceptions of America's commitment to nuclear disarmament, but they're there. And I really think that the United States has to completely re-envision its approach to nuclear non-proliferation, and only a true multilateral approach will bring us any closer to the realm of a nuclear-free world.
True multilateral approach can bring us to a nuclear-free world. All right, I want to ask some of the other fellows here. Is there a perspective that you want to bring in from your area of expertise? Could just leave it there. And if there are questions about it, for sure, we'd be happy to revisit under Q&A. So Philip, I know you mentioned the promise of sort of the spirit of multilateralism. So we don't necessarily have to talk about WMD's arms control, but what role do you see multilateral institutions such as NATO, and I do know you mentioned NATO earlier, have in the future of the Middle East?
Sure, yeah, I have a little more to say about that. So let me just put a disclaimer out there that, again, with disclaimers, as someone who's sort of grown up with a more leftist outlook on things, NATO was something that I grew up despising. It was a warmongering institution, but much like how we often now deride liberal democracy as inadequate, NATO was something that we will miss if it goes. So so God forbid. And why do I say this? Because NATO does promote a multilateral framework and democratic norms to the countries that are involved. And I have watched, especially when I lived in Turkey between 2012 and 2016, and the years since then, that in the last decade, essentially, as NATO's mission has frayed, as its binds have become looser, we have seen a severe democratic backsliding in Turkey and in other countries that are in NATO, particularly in Eastern Europe. And I now believe that if NATO were more committed to its original mission of democracy building and more willing to hold its members to account, that Turkey might not have morphed into the human rights disaster that it has become today. So I think that there is a future for NATO, should there be willingness to reform it, and maybe making it less about military action, more about promoting democracy. I know that's idealistic of me to say, but we need some idealism. Those that break the rules of NATO should be held accountable, and yes, that includes even Washington. In order for NATO to work, its most powerful member and founder must be willing to do more than simply talk the talk. And then I just would like to briefly say that as for other multilateral institutions in the Middle East, this decade has not been kind. What cachet does the Organization of Cooperation of Islamic States have when it fails to call out the abuses being meted against the Uyghurs in China? When it fails to stand up for Kurds as they face massacres, imprisonments, and cultural repression? Once again, for multilateralism to work, it requires states to live up to their words.
Requires for states to live up to their words. All right, Andrew, are there any other notions that you have about multilateral institutions like NATO, maybe another one, regarding the future of the Middle East?
Sure. So, I mean, when it comes to NATO specifically, I think within the Middle East, NATO is slowly withdrawing from the game there. I think, over time, we should, the role of, for example, the mission in Afghanistan, which had been the primary, NATO mission and how it reconceptualized itself after the end of the Cold War, I think is slowly but surely coming to an end. And I think there is broad consensus within the alliance that there needs to be a refocusing more towards the traditional deterrence mission, especially vis-a-vis Russia, protecting, for example, the Baltic states, Poland, the Black Sea region. I think NATO needs to be more engaged in the Caucasus, especially in supporting countries that want to be part of NATO, like Georgia, for example, as well as continuing to support reforms in Ukraine, all things that are very important, as well as, again, refocusing towards deterrence in terms of China, which the alliance has taken more and more of a stance on, especially in its most recent NATO 2030 report, the Secretary General and a number of experts just issued. That being said, when it comes to the Middle East specifically, I look more towards not as much official institutions as more as just ad hoc framework that have come together in the past. So, I think there is a possibility of revitalizing the JCPOA. I think it will be difficult as, Iran clearly wants all sanctions removed, and I'm not sure how possible that's going to be, at least given constraints, given domestic politics in the US. That being said, I think, with the new Abraham Accords that have come through, there might be an opportunity here to promote some sort of disarmament talks or mutual deterrence talks as a way of coming together on a consensus on Iran's nuclear program. One of the reasons why there was so much opposition and built up, especially in the U.S. and around the world, was that many of the countries, the Gulf Arab states, for example, as well as Israel, felt that they weren't consulted by the Obama administration when it came to negotiating the JCPOA. Regardless of whether that's true or not true, or it was just their reticence to getting involved. I think now that more and more of the Gulf Arab states are coming together, recognizing Israel clearly in a driven in part by a mutual fear and distrust of Iran, we might have a way of bringing these states together, especially when we talk about the elephant in the room, that being the Israelis' nuclear capability, their nuclear arsenal. That certainly is a factor when it comes to Iran's nuclear program, not just deterring outside invasion. The fact that Israel has a nuclear program and Iran does not. So possibly being able to put that on the table and keep the Middle East nuclear free, I think is an option moving forward. But it's going to be something that's done outside of, I think, official institutions.
There it goes. Had that problem with the mute button, but thank you for that, Andrew. Appreciate it. And so this notion of a sort of engagement for multilateral organizations isn't just applicable, of course, to the WMDs, Middle East space. I want to pose the secondary question to the panelists. I mean, what role can such institutions play in other, perhaps similar contexts in terms of de-escalating conflict or trade and development? Monica, Betsy, PJ? You want to go?
So I'm kind of happy to start this off. I can frame this in the context of kind of COVID-19 because this has been a horrendous year for women's rights as well as for everyone else. So I think you've seen a kind of, especially for the US, women were actually majority of workers in the United States for the first time ever. But obviously, women's fields have been targeted the most. And so, I mean, they were overrepresented in industries such as accommodation, food, retail, and services, which were all hit very, very hard by the pandemic. And so, I mean, over the course of the year, you've seen domestic violence increase by 30% in a lot of countries. You've seen women were already doing 3 times the household labor that men were. And so this has only increased with burdens, and long term, you're also just seeing the effects of educational decline. There's going to be a huge impact on education, and we know that education is one of the few things that really, really changes community dynamics regardless of country. And so I think that we're going to see a lot of backpedaling in the years to come and for generations to come. And I guess in terms of development, there have been a lot of policies and a lot of people have been researching and studying this, which is a very good sign. But in the case of gender, it's very, very hard to make these implementations. So most countries are binded by gender equality treaties and multiple, not only international, but regional institutions. But the implementation is very difficult on a lot of these. And so I think that there needs to be more engagement in the future of kind of finding ways, whether it's at a community level, rather than looking even at a state level, let alone multinational levels, to make kind of gender norms and kind of equality more essential. Because the way it is, a lot of the pressure is on women or governmental organizations to be like, we need to reach these quotas, we need to do this, we need to get there. But in the communities, if only women are being engaged, they can't be, not much can be done because more than half the population is being left out of these conversations. And if there's no mechanisms in which to institute changes, I think that development is a very, very difficult thing. And COVID-19 has only strengthened that. So, yeah.
Thanks for that, Monica. Yes, I think certainly in the United States, we know pretty well that women and other groups are disproportionately affected by sort of the secondary effects of COVID-19, even the primary effects. And of course, this is magnified in countries that perhaps aren't quite as developed as the United States. So I think from there, I'd love to turn to sort of the economics trade issue area. And I'll start with PJ on this one. Does the current state of multilateral institutions benefit developing nations, especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Sure. So there's sort of a theory that middle powers tend to be the most invested in multilateral institutions, countries like, for example, Canada or Sweden, because really powerful economic countries like China, the United States, they're more or less going to do what they want. That doesn't just apply to economics. That applies to most things in international relations. That smaller countries don't have as much of a say. I think overall, certainly the intent is there from the larger multilateral institutions like the UN, like the World Bank. The World Bank's purpose is to help out, provide loans to countries that are developing. So I think we have seen positive things. I'm not advocating for neoliberalism, but maybe it gets a little bit of a harsh rap for making inequality greater. And I think more economic opportunities have opened up. We've seen economic growth in a lot of developing nations as a result of more open economies and various treaties. But it has made the rich get richer. In terms of this year, it's complicated because global capital flows have slowed down. To counter this, the WTO and a lot of countries have reduced and made agreements more lax to increase the global economic recovery. And how long that will take, a lot of it depends less on the WTO and more on the external situation and what's going on with the pandemic. So it's a difficult question. I'm interested to see if anyone else has another perspective on it.
I think perhaps Betsy might have a perspective on it as the Africa Fellow. I know that she has a background in economic development.
Thanks, Neil, and great points, Monica and PJ. Just to build off of that and to add to the conversation, I think if we take a step back and think about the impact of not just COVID-19, but sort of multilateralism in the developing world, I think there's both a short-term and a long-term impact. In the case of Africa, COVID's terrible right now. I mean, first recession in 25 years, unprecedented debt crisis, people who were already living basically on a shoestring, I forget what the official status, but I think it's 30 million extra people put into poverty over the next few years. I mean, this is not going away anytime soon, even as things rebuild. But however, the fact that it's happened, at least on the African perspective, around the same time that the African Free Trade or African Continental Free Trade Agreement, I get so excited talking about it, I just can't help myself. The AFCFTA is really, something where that has been this idea for a long time, but really started to happen in 2019. Having the meeting its ratification in May of last year, it's actually supposed to go into effect in January of 2021. It's supposed to start July 1st this past year. That didn't happen with COVID. But the reason this is important is because, multilateralism in Africa isn't necessarily a choice sometimes. When you've got 54 countries, you have to be able to trade with each other. There's such a great opportunity for intercontinental trade that is simply not there right now. The opportunity is there, but the reality is not. And so the ACFTA is what makes that potential into reality. And, the quick stats are, the potential to bring 1.3 billion people across 55 countries with a combined gross domestic product of $3.4 trillion, according to the World Bank. The fact that enough countries have come on board to make this possible. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, 54 countries have signed the consolidated text of the agreement that established the AFCFTA. Only 32 have ratified it at this time, but only one country, Eritrea, did not sign. So the fact that enough African countries could get together around something beyond just the African Union, I think sends an important message. And this is an exciting opportunity for the Biden administration to not just give lip service to how great this trade agreement can be, but to really put U.S. strength behind supporting what African countries are leading the way in already, which is this mechanism for Africa's future growth, which was important before COVID, but now is all the more critical. And so we have this tool coming online. When those impacts come to bear in terms of bringing that economic prosperity, I think is really hard to say. It depends on a lot of factors, but that combined with the increase in technology and use of online ordering, things like that, really unlocks an exciting potential opportunity that I think we can look forward to on the African continent in the days ahead.
Great, thank you for that perspective. I do want to bring in a sort of an audience perspective on this in the form of a question. I see that David here asked, and obviously this isn't sort of talking about a free trade agreement among African countries, but certainly is affected by what he's posing here, which is how has China's Belt and Road Initiative affected multilateralism in the past, and what will be its effect in the future? Betsy, I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Thanks, Neil, and thanks, David, for submitting this question. You know, the Belt and Road Initiative has had a huge impact in Africa. It's not specific to Africa, as many of you may know. It's a huge initiative that China has undertaken to recreate effectively the Silk Road and connects throughout Europe, Asia, and I guess Southern Europe and Africa. From an African context, you know, Belt and Road Initiative is interesting. You know, it brings a lot of the infrastructure that countries need. It's put Africa on the map in a way that while U.S. foreign policy leaders are fairly right to criticize in many regards, at the same time, when you think about the $130 to $170 billion infrastructure financing gap that countries across the African continent face, you have to kind of take a step back and think, okay, well, you know, every country has their motive and their motivation for taking an action or carrying out an initiative. And certainly China's is to secure resources to ensure its economic dominance and to have influence, you know, over many parts of the world. It's in its own interest for the Belt and Road Initiative to be successful. But, you know, the side effects of that, and I think regardless of its motivation, means that if you have roads that allow countries to connect and trade more effectively between each other, if you bring greater connectivity that allows children, particularly girls in remote areas, to access education for the first time, or even lowers the cost of electricity, things that promote more both foreign direct investment as well as local businesses and entrepreneurs. You know, it's this is a very broad generalization, but I would say that I think the BRI it'll be interesting to see what the economic impacts of the BRI have on multilateralism moving forward. By definition, trade is multilateral, I think. I mean, you can have bilateral trade definitions, but we're talking about these sort of globalized engagements. By definition, you're going to have more than 3 countries most of the time. And I think it if used in the right way, presents an incredible opportunity. But how states leverage the opportunities it creates, I think, will be what answers that question in regards to multilateralism, if that makes any sense.
Thanks very much. I just want to open the floor to the other fellows. Do you have reactions? Do you see parallels in your sort of areas of expertise? Areas of focus.
Yeah, I'll step in because my first article was how Ethiopia can be the next China from an economic perspective, in terms of the opportunity to grow, because Ethiopia has been one of the largest growing countries, not just in Africa, but in the world. And China invested over $4 billion in a huge dam infrastructure project there to help development. So I think we're going to continue to see China growing its influence, its economic influence, which might be good from a development perspective. That we can debate that, not just in Africa, but throughout the world. What does that mean for multilateralism? I don't know. I think it certainly increases China's already numerous bilateral relations, but will that have any effect on multilateralism largely? These sort of like FDI, foreign direct investment projects often tend to be bilateral in nature. So I don't know if it will have a tremendous impact positively on multilateralism. I don't know if anyone has another perspective on that.
I'll just jump in briefly. And I think on when it comes to BRI, I think, you know, years ago, I think definitely the idea was, you know, a lot of, you know, some of the hopefulness that that Betsy, you know, articulated, particularly in developing countries in Africa. You know, this idea that, you know, we can take this money, it's not a debt trap. There's not going to be conditions later on that China expects countries that take this money to do something. You know, I think has really changed, and I think in part the COVID pandemic has really shown that. When China has gotten a lot more openly hostile to these countries, and especially on issues like the Uyghurs, for example, has really been able to marshal a lot of these African countries that have taken this money in votes, for example, in the United Nations, saying, oh yeah, there's nothing wrong here, nothing to see here, when clearly we know that's not true. On top of that, I think now a lot of countries are starting to take a hard look at, well, hey, what is this BRI money actually going to? What are Chinese companies investing in? How is the Chinese state choosing to spend its resources? What are they acquiring? It's not just rare earth minerals that are going into your smartphone. It's things that like computer chips. How is that going to affect, for example, a country's cyber infrastructure, their weapons development, all things that are going to matter, I think, in the future, and that a lot of countries now, I think, are taking a look at and saying, no, we don't really trust the Chinese anymore. We think there's an ulterior motive here. And I think that's forcing a lot, especially in Europe and the Indo-Pacific countries, to start to band together in coalitions against what they see as this increasingly pernicious influence that is undermining the security of these countries in many cases.
And if I just may say real quick, adding briefly onto what Andrew said, the United States and Washington, we're sort of watching this, and yet the United States has still largely opted out of sort of this backlash against the Belt and Road Initiative, and I think that this is a missed opportunity. And from my perspective, if we can, think about Sudan sort of as a Middle Eastern and East African country, this is the only place that the United States has sought to counter Belt and Road Initiative influence. And what was the purpose of it? Solely for the Abraham Accords. So I just think that the United States is continuously missing out on opportunities here.
Thanks for that. And Betsy, I know you wanted to.
If it's okay,
yeah, go ahead.
I'd love to just jump in quickly now, because Andrew and Philip both brought in two phenomenal points, which are so critical to include in this dialogue about the BRI in Africa specifically. And that is, Andrew, I'm really glad you mentioned the point of the China vote, because in the context of the role of African states in international multilateral organizations, trying to capture the Africa vote is, China's not the only country to use that tactic, but it is the one that has leveraged it the most, particularly in recent years with all of the loans, the insane amounts of financing that have gone into the African continent. And I think from a multilateral perspective, it is interesting. I look forward to when, African countries use that consensus, that 54 country voting bloc for their own initiatives, and not just to be quote unquote used by another power or influenced in that way. We all want to see but we all want, countries to be prosperous. We don't want to see conflict. We want countries to be able to have the infrastructure or the opportunities to create these futures for themselves. And so someone has to build the infrastructure. And I don't agree that the Chinese are necessarily the best, but I do look forward to when there is a time that there will be enough infrastructure in place that African countries themselves can leverage it. And hopefully the US will be a more active partner in shaping what that can be, if not building the roads ourselves, providing the skills training and the next layer that goes on top that really takes things to the next level in terms of acceleration. So Philip, I agree. We've really missed a lot of opportunities in the past, but it's not too late to take action moving forward, is my sense in that arena.
Missed opportunities in the past, but it's not too late. All right. I wanted to ask if any of you had any other perspectives related to the notion of how China is operating with the Belt and Road Initiative, how other countries are reacting. I don't know if, Monica, there's a perspective there that you want to put in.
So I guess most of my research on the BRI has actually come from the perspective of Mongolia, who was originally excluded from the BRI. And so for Mongolia, it's kind of this weird country in that it's part of East Asia, but it's not quite that, but it's not Central Asia either. And it's also a fairly democratic country that is stuck between Russia and China. So its policies differ a lot, and it's in a rough neighborhood. So I think that it was actually, I think a couple years after the BRI was introduced, Mongolia was actually included into that fold in terms of building oil pipelines and the rest. And so Mongolia already depends, I think, about 90% of its exports go to China. So it's very, very reliant on the country, even without external loans. And so Mongolia has been pretty lucky in that it's received a lot of external support, particularly from South Korea and Japan, as well as the US and a lot of other organizations because of its unique position. But because US support has been waning, I think that there has been a shift where it is kind of reaching towards a lot of these Chinese and Russian deals because it doesn't have much other support. And even if it is kind of undermining the morals in which it set itself, it's very important for the country because otherwise they don't have a lifeline to survive. And so I think kind of similar to Betsy saying that while, you know, it might not be ideal that China is making all this infrastructure, if no infrastructure would otherwise exist, it's very critical that someone is offering it, even if it comes with a lot of strings attached. So, yeah.
No, thank you for that perspective. I think it certainly shows the bind that some countries are in if they're not at the top, and there are other countries who are willing to provide infrastructural aid or loans that settle them with debt for years and years to come. And there might be other concessions that might be ulterior, some might argue. All right.
May I briefly comment on the Uyghur issue too? Multilateralism.
Sure. Sure, Philip. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, the Uyghur issue is, in my opinion, the great human rights issue of our time. And I do believe that it can basically be boiled down to genocidal at this point, what's going on. How is China getting away with this? They've essentially bought the silence of the Islamic world. You know, they bought the silence of Iran, of Saudi Arabia, of the Organization of Islamic States Cooperation, even of Turkey, which previously was, you know, a vocal supporter of the Uyghurs. So I think that it's a very simple concept here. I think that in order for China to be held accountable for the way that it's treating the Uyghurs, it needs a multilateral response. It needs other countries to speak up and to act on the issue here. Again, it's a very simple concept, but that's what needs to happen. It can't just be one or two countries that are really putting in all the effort. And I think this really starts with I think the Middle East changing its tune on what's going on there. It can't let its silence be bought on that, because the Middle East can be the Uyghurs' greatest advocates here, because China needs Middle Eastern investments. So, or rather, the Middle East needs Chinese investments. But yeah.
Thanks for that perspective. Yeah. Okay. I am going to talk a little bit about what we can expect moving forward. I'm also going to merge it with a previous question that somehow I missed, but I want to make sure it gets addressed. So I want to ask you all, how has the outgoing US presidential administration changed the nature of multilateralism, or has it? And what impact will the upcoming administration have on multilateralism? We can go ahead and start with Andrew.
Sure, thanks, Neil. So when it comes to the outgoing administration, I think, you know, it's fair to say I don't think the overall report card would be a very good grade in terms of preserving multilateralism. I mean, it's been a lot of breakdown, especially of traditional US alliances and of just global consensus when it comes to especially pursuing something like disarmament, arms control, things of the like. That being said, I do think the administration, the Trump administration, has done some good things in terms of, for example, challenging orthodoxy when it comes to, you know, I think specifically of the INF Treaty. You know, when Russia is consistently violating the spirit and intent of that treaty, why should a country like the United States continue to be limited by it? I think it was the right decision to pull out, and they were able to do so in a way that brought the NATO allies on board. They're also able, I think we're also able to, when it came to the New START treaty, while I do have a lot of criticism for how they have handled the renewal process, I think they were able to do a good thing in pressuring the Russians to drop their preconditions to getting a renewal. That being said, they have broken down a lot of trust within traditional alliances, be it NATO, the U.S.-European Union relationship, while also being, I think, highly antagonistic to a lot of other countries that the U.S. is now increasingly, I think, trying to bring on board in a, what it would term the renewed great power competition, to use the oft-repeated phrase, with China. And I think the incoming administration, the Biden administration, is going to have a real challenge in building that up, rebuilding that trust in traditional American alliances, rebuilding faith that something like arms control and non-proliferation is something important and worth pursuing, and something that's important to not only American security, but global security. And also looking at new approaches to problems that might have been disregarded during the Trump administration. For example, the North Korean nuclear program. We haven't mentioned that at all yet. North Korea, back in 2017, we thought we were on the brink of war, and then suddenly everything was all better. But during that time, the North Koreans have been able to build up all kinds of new missile capabilities, improving their technology and likely improving their stockpile of fissile material. Now Iran might be able to be doing the same. So these are all things that I think are going to be requiring new and novel approaches, and part of the challenge that the new incoming administration is going to have to face.
Yes, thank you for that, Andrew. Appreciate it. All right, Philip, what's changed? What could change in the future?
Yeah, I just have a couple of thoughts here. I mean, as I said at the beginning of the talk, the Trump administration has overseen a sort of near wholesale abandonment of multilateralism, and it has used sort of anti-multilateralist sentiment as a way to curry sort of support from the public. And I think the Biden administration is going to try and bring a return to multilateralism, and I think that it will likely advocate for a multilateral approach to human rights and democracy. I do think that Biden, with his sort of restoring the soul of America and restoring its promises, is really going to sort of play up the need for America to support human rights abroad. And it will obviously do so through a multilateral approach. But I just want to say the Biden administration must make sure that the United States abides by its own rules before it advocates for human rights in other countries. And let's just consider how useless America's words and commitments to multilateralism as a means to promote human rights and democracy are when you sort of think about what happened over the summer here in the United States, when American police were brutalizing peaceful American protesters decrying the death of George Floyd. Meanwhile, the State Department was urging other countries to abide by human rights conventions and for their police forces to show restraint. This hypocrisy is not doing the United States well anymore. Never has, of course. And I just would like to think back to sort of in the past. In the 1950s, Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson understood that in the order for America to be taken seriously in multilateral circles in its promotion for democracy and human rights, it had to live up by its own words and internally reform. This in turn helped to spawn the Civil Rights Act. And I think Biden would do well to stand by these lessons and apply them today. Reform at home, and that America's commitments to multilateralism and human rights will be more honest.
Thank you for that. Cutting down on the hypocrisy, being in line with what you say and what you do. I would also just like to thank some of the panelists who have been answering questions via typing. I know that we won't be able to get to every question tonight, so feel free, panelists, to answer them as you're not speaking this evening. So I appreciate that for sure. All right, let's ask the same question. What's changed? What the impact will be in the upcoming administration? PJ.
Sure. So I actually was able to see President Biden speak a long time ago, about 2 years ago, when we weren't sure if he was going to be running. It was at the University of New York. I got there late, so I had to watch on like a jumbotron instead. But broadly speaking, as you would expect with a Democratic candidate, I think will look. There'll be more renewed economic multilateralism. I think if we're up to Donald Trump, I think like he would just wouldn't want the UN to exist. I mean, he wanted to reduce funding for the UN. Thank God that there's checks and balances in Congress. President Biden he was actually the head of the Foreign Relations Committee back in, I mean, he's been not in office for God knows how long, but so he's had experience working with the UN, and back then he agreed to reduce the amount of funding if certain criteria were met to about a quarter of the UN's funding. So the US does provide about a quarter of it. But going forward, he's been sort of opaque on what they'll do, and I think it's going to be difficult to say based off of what is happening in the world right now. So but I think overall we're going to see renewed economic communication and multilateralism, but that's also, the bar was pretty low before. So yeah, I'm curious to see what you guys think about that.
Sure, and I'd happy to hear what Betsy has to think about that.
There we go.
There you go.
Sorry, I'll make sure I hit the correct button. Didn't want to lose my screen again there. Thank you. Looking ahead, two things come to mind for me considering the Biden administration in Africa. The first is tremendous opportunity to improve both sort of hard and soft relations. I like what you said, Philip. Not only speaking the talk, but actually beginning to walk the walk, or beginning to rebuild trust where past comments that have been made, or engagements, or even lack thereof, sent a message of maybe not the message that we'd like to send as an ally to our African partners and African countries. So I think there is a tremendous opportunity to renew relationships, provide strong direction. Biden clearly has a lot of political and leadership experience coming into the office in that regard. One thing though I do, regardless of the U.S., what Africa, is facing, and I think this is a really exciting time. There's some really big challenges. We think about how the youth population in Africa is expected to increase over 500 million people in the next, 30 years. That the continent's, the number of young people on the continent will double by 2050. That's insane. At the same time, already over 60% of the population's 1.3 billion people are under the age of 25. And the implications from that, Neil, as you know, are widespread across development. Monica, as you know, are huge for gender. PJ, economics, are there going to be enough jobs? And as we know, this can present an incredible opportunity to harness the youth and potential and innovation, all that this growing young population has to offer. But we also know if there aren't jobs, it can be a huge stabilizing force. I also think about, the fact that the number of cities with 5 million people or more inhabitants will triple over the next just 10 years, just in the next decade. And so I think about the increasing urbanization. What does that mean for the quality of life for people? What does that mean for transportation? What does that mean for food? With COVID lockdowns, that really made open people's eyes about local sourcing and those supply chains. And then, as we said before, the infrastructure, the 130 billion to 170 billion infrastructure gap, the fact that 600 million people still don't have energy in sub-Saharan Africa alone. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. We're not even talking about water or healthcare or any of the other things which we all know play into how stable or not countries can be, how fast or slow they can grow, how soon or off in the future they can really maximize their full potential. And Africa, I guess my bottom line would be Africa has so much to offer the world, and it's going to move ahead whether the US is on board or not. Because the potential is there, the growth is there, the power is there, it's just a matter of when. And so one thing I do hope to see Biden continue is the inspiration behind Prosper Africa, which was the Trump administration's creation of a way to leverage and catalyze US investment in Africa. Because many times people fairly, and I promise I'll keep to my time limit on this, Neil, so just one quick, I'll finish out the last 20 seconds. So with Prosper Africa, this is really the first time there's been a coordinated US government response across, I believe it's 17 government agencies that have said, wait a minute, we're already working in Africa, we're already working with investment, but no one's talking to each other. How can we help American businesses who want to do business in Africa or who are already doing business there expand, grow, have that impact, help create those jobs? And that is an incredible opportunity, because when critics say well, the China's investing, where's the US? Well, there's more people need roads, but they also need a lot more than roads. And so that's where I think the US has such a critical role to play, but without the private sector, without that boots on the ground engagement, it really is just going to be rhetoric. And I really think, I look at African nations as driving that dialogue. They're leading the way, but the US has an incredible opportunity to come alongside in that process. And I hope to see that not only continue, but expand. It's an incredible opportunity.
People need roads, but people need a lot more than roads. I like that. All right, Monica, what's changed and since this last administration has come into power, and then as we transition to the new one?
Yeah, so I do think one of the things that the Trump administration has been able to do well was mobilize protest against the administration, both in the US and in other countries. And so I do think that one thing that is a huge issue that I guess the Trump administration did bring to light is how there still is a lot of inequality, both among gender, among race, among class, and a lot of that still hasn't been resolved. And now, in large part due to the pandemic, but also due to underlying systemic issues that haven't ever gone away, I think a lot of that has emerged, and we are going to see a lot more people in the future interested and involved in those issues because it's come to global attention. And so I do think that the Trump administration, especially in regards to gender issues, has lost a lot of faith in the United States that won't easily be gained back. Even with the new incoming Biden administration, there's still going to be probably a lot of hesitation on the parts of other countries and other multilateral organizations to really trust the US. Not to say that the Biden administration won't involve itself very deeply with gender issues, but just if it's sustainable, because if you see new administrations after that just undermining it and doing a flip-flop back and forth on especially kind of going to big international agreements, it's going to undermine global confidence in the US, period. So, I mean, one of the big things that you have seen is that, so the percentage of US aid marked for genders explicitly for foreign aid went from a peak of 8% in 2016, and nearly the highest it had ever been, to 2.5% by 2018. So huge decrease in that. Even within the US, you've seen a barrage of anti-abortion laws come into play, and oftentimes this is at the state level, but it's been supported by, I mean, the the national administration. And this doesn't necessarily just affect the US, because one of the things that the Trump administration also did was reinstate a Reagan era global gag ban on talking about family planning issues. And so there was even, I think, and this was in early October, but the Geneva Consensus Declaration on Promoting Women's Health and Strengthening the Family, the US was one of the co-sponsors of this bill, which theoretically was to support women, but essentially it stated that in no case should abortion be promoted as a method of family planning. And so this affected over $9 billion in US foreign aid to not only organizations that supported, say, abortion or just family planning, but even to things such as like water sanitation and malaria and HIV crises. And so without this, it's going to be very difficult, even for the Biden administration, even though that they've said that they'll roll these back. I do think it's going to be a very difficult process, both in kind of gaining back the trust, especially at local levels in countries where a local organization in Africa may not necessarily understand the implications of a changing administration and may be wary of accepting future aid if it's going to be revoked again. So I do think that the Biden administration has set itself up to really be and promote gender equality, but I think it's going to be a difficult path, and it's going to have ramifications regardless that hold over from previous administrations.
Great, thank you, appreciate that. I know you hit on that notion of the need for continuity, for folks to see us as sort of that beacon for standing up for those rights, for instance. So I'm going to now cut down on everyone's time. We're going to do something of a lightning round. I do want to go back to a question that I did happen to miss. And so everyone, each 1 minute, I want you to tell me of a recent example, something that would stick with the audience of multilateralism that has been effective. Has it happened during this pandemic? Is it a recent treaty or trade deal? I think I heard a little bit of inklings from folks that would be a pretty good answer to this. So let's go ahead and start with Monica. 1 minute.
Oh, can you restate the question, please?
Sure. It's so a recent example of multilateralism that has been effective, that's been positive, that's had an impact that is beneficial for folks in a certain region or place.
This isn't necessarily super current, but one recent resolution by the UN, resolution 2493 in 2019, was actually super essential to promoting women, and because it promoted women, peace, and security agenda. So it kind of wanted to facilitate the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women. And so meaningful is often left out, as is full, oftentimes in these conversations, in that they want women to participate, but not necessarily to the full extent, because they still assume that they'll be in marginalized position. So I think that it was really important because it actually put into motion a series of policies that had been around since the 2000s, but hadn't been institutionalized within the UN. And so while this is a very broad and overreaching policy, I do think that it signifies a very good statement for the future, because if you have these policies in place, you can use that to back up statements when you're applying local and national policies in the future.
Thank you. And you did really great on the 1 minute. Appreciate it. All right, we can go to Betsy. A recent example of multilateralism that has been effective.
Thanks, Neil. I just have to go back to the AFCFTA. I just think it's amazing. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time. But the fact that it is coming into being, and it will be starting next year, the fact that countries can already begin to trade and are beginning to harmonize the regimes, there are phases of the AFCFTA. There's a lot that each country needs to do, some more than others, to comply with those restrictions, or rather the regulations. There needs to be harmonizing trade preferences. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done. This is far from over. It's really just the beginning. But even if it took 3 to 5 years, the potential and the collective effort that it represents to me is honestly unprecedented, in the sense that, again, of all these 3 types of multilateralism in regards to Africa I mentioned earlier, I really feel that the multilateralism of African countries themselves and how they organize, whether it's through those 8 regional blocks but more broadly through the AFCFTA, I think represents a tremendous maybe renewal of how we'll think about multilateralism and what that means at the regional level within African states. Yeah, AFCFTA, I'm a huge fan.
Yep, that's what I expected you to say. I know that it's fun to say all the letters. All right, let's now go to PJ.
Sure. So I think that we've done a good job with some of the sustainable development goals from an economic perspective. We have seen reductions in poverty all over the world, particularly in Africa, and a lot of countries making their financial commitments, not always in full, but for the most part. So I think that's important. And for my second future point, which hasn't happened, I have to build off of Betsy was saying, because there is a lot of potential for Africa in the future. The free trade agreements, the possibility of a central bank and unified currency, I guess very similar to the Eurozone, has a lot of positive economic implications. It has a lot of positive diplomatic implications. And in the next few years, when things sort of go back to normal from an economic perspective, I think that's something that we should be very excited about for the whole continent of Africa. Their unified economic future can further help eradicate poverty.
Excellent, thank you. All right, and Philip.
Yeah, I'm gonna think a little bit outside of the box here, and let's go back to 2014 when the Malaysian Airlines flight was shot down over Ukraine by Russian backed militias. This case was essentially solved by sort of what we can call like private multilateralism. Sort of all these investigators from different countries, open source investigators, came together and sort of put together all the data through the help of Bellingcat. And because of their work, essentially, we were able to identify that it was indeed Russia that shot down this passenger plane and killed over 200 people. And then this has been brought forward to international courts. So this is sort of a private multilateralism that I think is very effective, and with the internet may sort of point to the future of how multilateralism will work.
Great, thanks very much. Appreciate that. All right, and last but not least, we'll go ahead to Andrew.
Thanks, Neil. So quickly, I think I'll just try to circle back around to something that I said in the beginning, and that is, multilateralism in terms of deterrence and nonproliferation isn't just arms control agreements and treaties. It's also how countries can band together to improve their own deterrence. And I think we've seen significant progress there. Let's not forget this year, North Macedonia joined NATO as the 30th member. They changed their name through a long fought agreement with Greece to become member of the alliance and begin their path towards Euro-Atlantic integration. That's a big milestone that was brought together in part because of shared concerns of Russian influence in the Western Balkans. We can probably say the same thing about Chinese influence in the region as well. I would also circle back to the restart of the quadrilateral security dialogues between the US, Japan, India, and Australia. Bringing back that relationship, especially with India, over renewed security concerns, I think is something that's important. It's going to promote more exchange. These new relationships will bring together both civilians and military personnel that I think, if used effectively, can not only increase security in the future, but also push back against authoritarian impulses and tendencies that we see in the world today.
All right. Thank you very much. A lot to chew on, a lot to think about. Thank you all for such a great discussion. Like I said from the beginning, right? Multilateralism has layers like an onion or Shrek or something like that. But Philip, Andrew, PJ, Monica, Betsy, thanks so much for joining us for what has been a lively, enjoyable discussion. I want to thank YPFP members who are in attendance for spending time with us today. I do apologize for not getting to all the questions today. Hopefully it's something that you might be able to connect with some of these YPFP fellows. There'll be more information about this upcoming year's YPFP fellowship, so keep an eye out for an event on that. And if you're not currently a YPFP member, I just posted in the link there. Go ahead and follow that link, and you should be able to become a member today. I hope everyone has, I feel like this might be one of the last events that folks are attending before not going to events like this for the rest of this year. So I wish you all a warm, happy holidays, stay safe. I hope in any way that you can are able to connect with your friends, family, and loved ones. And we, of course, hope to see you all soon, virtually, but in 2021, hopefully in person. So take care. Thanks, all.
Thank you.
No.
Thanks again, everybody.